In 2009, engineers in London began drilling 42 kilometers of tunnel beneath one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe. The project was called Crossrail, a new east-west railway that would become the Elizabeth Line, connecting Reading and Heathrow in the west to Shenfield and Abbey Wood in the east. It was the largest construction project in Europe. The budget was nearly £15 billion. 8 tunnel boring machines, each weighing 1,000 tons and stretching over 100 meters, would chew through clay, sand, gravel, and chalk at depths of 15 to 30 meters below the surface. The engineers knew they would find things. London has been built on top of itself for 2,000 years. Roman over Celtic, Saxon over Roman, medieval over Saxon, Tudor over medieval, Victorian over Tudor, modern over everything. Every major construction project in central London encounters fragments of the past. Archaeologists were embedded into the project from the beginning. Over 100 of them were assigned to monitor more than 40 excavation sites along the route. They were prepared. They were not prepared enough. Before we dive in, this channel explores the hidden worlds buried beneath the surface. Hit that subscribe button. Let's get into it. The first major discovery came at Charterhouse Square in Farringdon, where engineers were sinking a small shaft, roughly 5 meters in diameter, for a ventilation structure. The archaeologists had suspected a plague burial ground might exist somewhere in the vicinity, but the exact location was unknown. Historical records indicated that during the Black Death of 1348, when the bubonic plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of London's population in a single year, emergency burial grounds were established outside the city walls because the parish churchyards could no longer hold the dead. Charterhouse Square was one of those sites, but no one knew precisely where the bodies were. The shaft came down directly onto the burial ground. At a depth of roughly 2.5 meters beneath the modern road surface, the excavators found skeletons. 13 of them were laid out in rows, carefully arranged, some stacked 2 deep. They had been there since 1348. Later, DNA analysis confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, in the dental pulp of several of the skeletons. These were confirmed victims of the Black Death, the pandemic that killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia in the 14th century. The skeletons had been lying 5 feet beneath one of London's busiest intersections for 660 years. People had been walking over them, driving over them, and living on top of them without ever knowing they were there. But Charterhouse Square was only one site. The largest and most complex excavation along the Crossrail route was at Liverpool Street, on the eastern edge of the City of London. The construction of a new underground station required the excavation of a site that turned out to be sitting directly on top of the new churchyard, a burial ground that had been in use from 1569 to 1739. The new churchyard was not attached to any church. It was a municipal burial ground, established in 1569 on land that had belonged to Bedlam Hospital, the institution known to Londoners then and now as Bedlam. Bedlam was the first dedicated psychiatric institution in Europe, founded in 1247 as a priory by a wealthy former sheriff of London named Simon Fitzmary. By 1403, the majority of its residents were described in official records as lunatics. By the 16th century, the hospital had become notorious across England for the conditions in which its patients lived. Inmates were restrained with manacles, flogged, kept in solitary confinement, and housed in cells where the straw bedding was saturated with human waste. There was no treatment in any modern sense. There was no distinction made between curable and incurable patients. They were not even called patients until 1700. Before that, the official term was inmates. The hospital's vegetable garden was converted into a burial ground in 1569, when the city's churchyards began to overflow under the pressure of London's expanding population. For the next 170 years, the poor, the unclaimed, the religiously non-conforming, and the mentally ill of London were buried there. Because it was a municipal ground, not a parish ground, it accepted anyone, Dissenters, foreigners, plague victims, executed criminals, stillborn children, and the anonymous dead found in the streets. One entry in the parish records from 1577 reads, "A poor woman who died in the street, whose name we know not, nater from where she was. But as we suppose, she was a maid, and thought of some to be a Welsh woman." An estimated 25,000 people were interred in the new churchyard. Over the course of its use, 16 volunteers working with Crossrail's archaeology team spent years searching parish records across London to build a database of the names and backgrounds of those buried there. They identified over 5,300 individuals. Among them were political activists, including John Lilburne and Robert Lockyer, members of the Levelers movement, and Nicholas Culpeper, the famous botanist and herbalist. The poor, the powerful, and the forgotten were buried side by side, their identities preserved in scattered parish records, while their bodies lay forgotten beneath a modern street. When Crossrail's archaeologists began excavating the site in 2011, they found the dead almost immediately, starting just 5 feet below the surface. Over the next 4 years, working 6 days a week, a team of 60 archaeologists excavated 3,354 skeletons. It was the largest collection of 16th to 18th century human remains ever recovered in London. The skeletons told stories that no written record had preserved. Osteological analysis revealed evidence of malnutrition, rickets, syphilis, tuberculosis, and the physical deformations caused by a lifetime of manual labor. Some individuals showed signs of healed fractures that had set badly, suggesting they had no access to medical care. Others had dental wear patterns consistent with specific trades, pipe smoking, thread biting, and metalworking. One skeleton was found in a sand-filled coffin with heavy stones placed on the lid, a measure taken against body snatchers who sold corpses to anatomists. Among the dead were victims of the Great Plague of 1665, London's last major outbreak of bubonic plague. It was a catastrophe that killed roughly 100,000 Londoners in a single year, nearly a quarter of the city's population. A mass grave containing 42 individuals was found near the surface. The bodies laid quickly, without individual coffins, some with lime poured directly onto them to accelerate decomposition and reduce the spread of disease. DNA testing confirmed plague bacteria in 5 of the 42, the first certain identification of plague DNA from 17th century Britain. The lead archaeologist on the project said the discovery opened a critical question. The year 1665 was the last recorded major plague outbreak in London. Before that, plague had returned to the city every few decades for over 400 years. And then it stopped. Nobody has been able to fully explain why. The hope was that by extracting ancient DNA from the teeth of confirmed plague victims, researchers could track how the bacterium changed over those 4 centuries, potentially explaining why it suddenly lost its ability to devastate the city. The plague victims of 1665 were buried on top of the plague victims of 1348, who were buried on top of the medieval poor, who were buried on top of the Roman road that ran through the area when it was a suburb of Londinium. Layer upon layer, century upon century, all of it less than 3 meters below the surface of a modern London street, and the bodies were only part of what Crossrail found. At Tottenham Court Road, the excavation uncovered 13,000 preserved glass jars, pickle pots, and jam containers from a 19th century Cross and Blackwell factory that had been demolished to make way for the tunnel. The jars were stacked in an underground vault, still sealed, their labels still legible. A perfectly preserved snapshot of Victorian industrial food production buried beneath one of London's busiest intersections. At Canary Wharf in East London, the tunnel route passed through geological layers far older than any human settlement. Archaeologists found reindeer antlers and bison bones dated to 68,000 years ago. From the last ice age, evidence that the Thames Valley was once an open tundra where herds of large mammals grazed. A fragment of a woolly mammoth jaw was recovered from the same deposit. At North Woolwich, they recovered Mesolithic flint tools from 8,000 years ago. Evidence of toolmaking on the banks of the Thames when Britain was still connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge called Doggerland, before the North Sea flooded it around 6,100 BCE. At Stepney Green, they found a perfectly preserved Roman road, its gravel surface still compacted, its drainage ditches still defined, running through what had been a suburb of Roman Londinium 2,000 years ago. Roman horseshoes, known as hippo sandals, were found nearby, cast iron devices strapped to the hooves of horses and mules that pulled carts along roads like this one. A rare medallion of the Roman Emperor Philip I, minted in the year 245, was found at a nearby site, only the second example of its kind ever discovered in Europe. At the Thames Ironworks site in East London, they uncovered the remains of London's last major shipyard, where HMS Warrior, the Royal Navy's first iron-hulled armored warship, had been built in 1860. The anchor chains were still there, massive iron links embedded in the riverbank mud, alongside the foundations of slipways where ships had been launched into the Thames for over a century. At Paddington, they found a Tudor bowling alley. At Farringdon, they found medieval bone ice skates, polished animal bones that Londoners strapped to their shoes to glide across the frozen marshes of Moorfields in winter, a practice described by the 12th century chronicler William Fitzstephen as a popular winter amusement of the city's young men. At every site, at every depth, at every point along the 42-kilometer route, the machines hit something. Crossrail's lead archaeologist described it as taking a slice down through London and across London simultaneously. The project did not excavate a single site. It excavated a cross-section of the entire city, from the Ice Age bones in the east to the Roman suburb in the center to the Tudor entertainments in the west, spanning 55 million years of geological and 8,000 years of human history. Over 100,000 artifacts were recovered from the 40 sites. 500 of them were selected for a public exhibition at the Museum of London Docklands in 2017. The rest are in storage, catalogued, studied, and waiting for the space to display them. The Elizabeth Line opened on May 24, 2022, named in honor of Queen Elizabeth II during her Platinum Jubilee. Trains now run every 2.5 minutes through the central section during peak hours, carrying over 1 million passengers a day through tunnels carved through the same earth that held Roman roads, plague victims, medieval ice skaters, Tudor bowlers, Bedlam inmates, and the bones of animals that roamed London when it was still tundra. Most of those passengers have no idea what was found beneath the stations they passed through. At Liverpool Street, the platform sits above the Bedlam burial ground, where 3,300 bodies were extracted one by one over 4 years. At Farringdon, the ventilation shaft passes within meters of the Black Death Pit, where 13 skeletons were found stacked in rows, still carrying the bacteria that killed them in 1348. At Tottenham Court Road, 13,000 Victorian jam jars sit in a museum warehouse, cleaned and catalogued, waiting to be displayed. The lead archaeologist on the project said that London is one of the most difficult cities in the world to undertake this type of excavation. It has been here for 2,000 years. Every hole you dig, every shaft you sink, every tunnel you bore, you are cutting through someone else's history. The city is a vertical archive. The surface is just the most recent page. When the Crossrail tunneling was complete, 2 of the 8 tunnel boring machines could not be extracted. Their front sections, massive steel cutting heads, and drive assemblies weighing hundreds of tons were too deep and too large to retrieve without dismantling the tunnels they had just built. They were left in the ground, sealed behind concrete plugs, permanently entombed near Farringdon Station. Buried somewhere near Farringdon Station, sealed in concrete and earth, those machines now sit alongside the Roman horseshoes, the plague bones, and the mammoth jaw. One more layer added to a city that has never stopped burying itself. Future archaeologists digging through the layers of London 1,000 years from now will find them there, rusting quietly in the dark, surrounded by the dead of 6 centuries, and the debris of 2,000 years of continuous habitation. London has always been a city built on its own dead. Crossrail did not change that. It just showed everyone what was already there, 5 feet below the street, waiting to be found by anyone willing to dig deep enough. Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of exploration you want to follow, subscribe. There is more to come.